Hi, everyone. This is Javier, your host here at the Restore Podcast. We would love to hear your thoughts about the Restore Podcast topics, guests, your favorite episodes, or whatever you may want to let us know. And I am so happy to announce that now you can do that simply by texting us by going to the show notes. There, you will see a link that simply says, send us a text message. Click on it. Don't remove the number there that you will see and simply send us a text. Simple as that. So don't wait. Go to any episode show notes and text us now. Let us know your thoughts. We can't wait to hear from you. God bless.
Welcome to Restore, a podcast seeking to restore the vision, restore the mission, restore the church. And now your host, Javier Diaz.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Restore Podcast, a podcast seeking to help restore the vision, restore the mission, restore the church by God's Spirit and grace to what He would have it to be. My name is Javier. I'm your host, and this is episode 102. And on today's episode, I welcome Pastor Raewyn Orlich. She's an associate pastor at La Sierra University Church, focusing on discipleship and nurture. I invited her to come and talk about her book entitled In Grandpa's Shoes, an invitation to intergenerational connection. We, of course, talk about her faith journey, her call to pastoral ministry, and so much more. Discipleship is a topic that we've talked a lot about over time on this podcast, but I love this specific focus on intergenerational discipleship, and I hope that you will be blessed and challenged by this conversation as God leads you in your discipleship journey. With that said, I've partnered with Advent Source, and they've been so gracious to give me 5 copies of Pastor Raewyn's book, In Grandpa's Shoes, an invitation to intergenerational connection. And there's 2 ways that you can possibly win a copy of her book. One is that you can text us. By now, you've heard the pre-roll announcement about how to text us by simply going to the show notes and clicking on the link that says send us a text message. And so you can do it that way. You can let us know via text that you listened to this specific episode and what you thought. And of course, give me your name and the address that you would like for me to send the book. Your information is never shared with anyone. Or you can also simply just email me at Javier, Javier.Diaz, Diaz, at floridaconference.com. And if you are one of the first 5 to either text or email me, I'll send you a copy of her book for free. Make sure to check out the show notes for a link to purchase the book from Advent Source if you are not one of the winners. And also check out the link to her podcast, which goes along with the book. With that said, here's my conversation with Pastor Raewyn Orlich. Pastor Raewyn Orlich, welcome to the Restore Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you, Raewyn. We were just talking before I hit record how we crossed paths in seminary. We're going to get into it in just a moment, but I already want to congratulate you on the book. I know it's been out for a bit. I'm so honored to have you on that we could unpack the theme of the book and many amazing stories that you have there. And so I look forward to that conversation in just a moment. But let me start as I always do here on the podcast. Raewyn, tell us about your faith journey and your call to pastoral ministry.
Thank you so much. So I was born in South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa. And at the time, my mom, it was just me and my mom in that moment. And we went to be with my grandparents in their home. And my grandparents have been, their family has been Adventist for quite a few generations. I'm 5th generation Adventist, and they'd been in South Africa since the 1800s. So, South Africa was home. And I was born into my grandparents' home. With my mom and my grandparents. And I remember very early faith formation, singing, family worship, seeing my grandparents and my mom kneeling and praying, and those early moments of connection. And I remember being at church in Claremont, Seventh-day Adventist Church, and my grandmother always having mints or something to give me to keep me occupied, and seeing my grandpa preaching. So those early years till I was about 4 years old were very formational, in my journey. And then my mom remarried. We moved to Berrien Springs, Michigan. And there I really was blessed by the community at Andrews University. I went to Ruth Murdoch Elementary School. And I have to thank the school and the university and all the incredible people there. We did not have a lot of money, being immigrants to the country and just selling everything we had and coming. And I saw the beautiful generosity of the church, Christmas presents, Thanksgiving baskets, scholarships, coats in the winter, all of these various ways that we were cared for by that community. And, I had a desire to know Jesus and grow closer to him. And went through some trials and challenging things. My mom and stepdad got divorced when I was about 11. And in that time, in that season, we went through a lot of trauma. And I really felt very connected to God as Father. Ironically, I was losing someone who I had called Father in my life, but, God as Father became really meaningful and special to me. And I think part of that is the early connection I had with my grandfather, and his stability and care and the special connection that we had from early on. So when I was 11, I decided to get baptized, and my grandfather baptized me at the Pioneer Memorial Church.
Yeah.
And from there, ministry, my mom was a single mom, myself, and I have a sister who's 4.5 years younger than me, who also went into pastoral ministry.
Okay.
She and her husband are both pastoring 2 different churches in Reno, Nevada, about 15 minutes apart. And so the first ministry opportunity I can remember is when I was in 8th grade. And my mother was attending a Sabbath afternoon training on small groups, leading a small group. And I wasn't doing anything. I was going with my mom. And so I attended the training and started a little small group with some girls in 8th grade, and experienced inductive Bible study, which I really sparked some joy and interest for me. Then I went to Andrews Academy, and there, the Bible teachers, chaplains really were amazing at believing that all of us were called to ministry as teenagers. And we did a revival series and week of prayer for the school. And so they just believed that we were ministers and just put us to work, as it were, as teenagers. And that was very, very meaningful and important in my journey. And I also worked at, I was in the season where teenagers could still get jobs. I know it's very difficult sometimes, in today's economy for teenagers to work and all of that. But, I got a job at Adventist Information Ministries. And so we answered the phone, after Amazing Facts and It Is Written and, all the other pretty much Adventist media that was out there. And we would be the ones on the other end saying, oh, you would like that book? Okay, I'll put that in the computer for you, and talking with people. And I loved talking with people, and I really enjoyed encouraging people to have Bible studies. And the way that would work is we'd get them connected with Bible studies, and then the chaplains, who were seminary students, would call the local church pastors and get them connected to have those Bible studies. And I had that dream of, well, what if I could be the one to go and give them the Bible studies? And years later, full circle, I did have that opportunity to go and have Bible studies with some people who were called by AIM. And I had the joy of baptizing a mother and her son, which was incredible. So I had this strong feeling of joy around ministry and a sense of calling. But it wasn't easy to answer that call, because at the time I really only knew of one pastor that was a female, Esther Knott. Pastor Esther Knott. And I was aware of a lot of, I was first aware that women weren't being hired to be pastors. And then I was aware of a lot of arguments against why women should be pastors and why they should not. So I had to wrestle with that for myself, and read the passages that are referred to and try to understand, is this calling that I sense for pastoral ministry? Because I was sure that if I was a boy, I would be a pastor. I was sure. So it was really about gender for me that I hesitated. So I had to go back to those scriptures and find ways to understand them more. Yeah. And then, see the two things that really clinched it for me in scripture, was seeing how Jesus treated women at the time and how he called women to be evangelists, from the women at the well to the women at the tomb. And in a culture where women were not witnesses, he called the women to be those witnesses. And that impressed me. And then Paul worked with women and mentions a lot of women that were leaders of house churches and part of deacons and apostles. And so the example that I saw of women in ministry there in scripture, and then I felt the overall trajectory that the New Testament writers were feeling called to impress, to take us on, epitomized in Galatians 3:28, that in Christ there's no longer Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male or female, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. And I came to understand that the status differences that we would see based on our ethnicity or based on our social economic status or our gender, that those status differences should not be the case within the church. And so from my journey with scripture, I felt, okay, I can understand that why God could be calling me. The other aspect was seeing more women in pastoral ministry, looking at them, seeing their ministry, and then being like, well, I cannot deny that they're called. So therefore, if they're called, then I can also be called. So it was a combination of looking at scripture and then seeing more women ministering in that way and not being able to deny that God was using them. And part of that was going from Andrews. I started at Andrews University my freshman year. I was going to finish at Andrews. That was my plan. But I wanted to go somewhere else just for a quarter, and I was going to go overseas, but that fell through last minute. And so my aunt said, why don't you come to La Sierra University? I had really never heard of La Sierra University. And California seemed like a different enough country than Michigan, to have it be my different experience, cultural experience. So I came to La Sierra for one quarter and I stayed till I graduated. And I did see more women on the West Coast serving in those roles, and that inspired me. And I would say in terms of my faith journey, Andrews, the way I like to describe it is Andrews gave me roots, very strong roots. My relationship with God, what it means to grow as a disciple, a follower of Jesus, how to have God be first in my life. And then I like to say that La Sierra gave me wings. And what I mean by that is, being there, based on some of the emphasis, it expanded my vision of the impact my faith should make, not only on myself as an individual, but the impact that our faith makes on society as a whole. Not simply to encourage individuals to join the church, but also to be change agents in the society as well. And that really impressed me. I had professors like Dr. Teal, who was part of the civil rights movement at the time and talked about the impact that made. And we at La Sierra, they have it's called the Path of the Just. And it's remembering people that stood up for their convictions and lived out the gospel in society and the difference that makes. So yeah, that was very formational for me. And then I graduated from La Sierra, got called by Southeastern California Conference, and then sent back to seminary to study as a sponsored student, which was an incredible answer to prayer and a miracle that I could be paid to go home, as it were.
There you go.
Yeah. And then went to seminary, and then since then have been here in Southeastern. I served as so my first assignment was at the Yucaipa Seventh-day Adventist Church, where I was the children, family, youth, and young adult pastor. And then from there, I served for 7.5 years as a senior pastor up in the high desert. And now I've been at La Sierra University Church for discipleship and nurture for 5 years come October, this coming October, right before the pandemic.
Wow. Well, Raewyn, thank you for sharing that. Amazing the way the Lord has led you, as you started by saying you are a 5th generation Adventist. And we're going to speak about that in just a moment here and kind of unpack that from your book. But let me stick here a little bit with your story. First of all, we praise God that and firmly believe, I said we because I can say this on behalf of Florida Conference, that we are 100% for women in pastoral ministry because we believe that God calls both men and women. And so I praise God that you accepted that call and moved forward, even with all the challenges that you faced that I, as a man, did not have to face, to be honest with you. And so thank you for that. And just from your book itself, I know a little bit more about just your journey. But for those that haven't read your book, and we're going to be talking about it here, tell us a little bit about, and I've asked this to other pastors, that first moment, right, when you leave seminary, and now Pastor Raewyn is at her first experience, right? What was that like, particularly for you? You're going back, you said in Yucaipa, if I said that right. And so what was that like? How did the church receive you? Was it perhaps their first time having a female pastor with them? So kind of unpack that experience and how that formed you as you journeyed to where you are today at La Sierra. Is that a fair question?
Yes. Javier, I think I would back up a little bit and talk about my very first pastoral experience, which was pre-seminary. So,
all right, sure.
Right after college, I was 20, I'm trying to remember, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I think I was 21.
Okay.
Graduated, came down to Chula Vista, and I really had no idea what to do. So this is pre-seminary. I'd been in college, and I had my apartment and I had my office, and then I thought, okay, now what? I completely designed my own schedule, and it's okay. It's kind of the freedom in pastoral ministry can be a little overwhelming when you're first starting out. But I had an incredible mentor, Pastor Dale Barizo. He since has passed away. He died of cancer a few years ago. But he and his wife were incredible mentors, and he just took me with him to visitation. And we went to the jail one time, and the attendant there thought that I was the bride, and he was the pastor, and that he was marrying me off to someone there.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But I think that was my first, within pastoral ministry, for Pastor Barizo to be such a great mentor and discipler, was beautiful. So I think Chula Vista, the experience of really not knowing what to do, freedom, but lots of opportunities. And I really enjoyed getting to know the youth there and investing in relationships. And my experience there, not everyone was excited that I was coming. And Pastor Barizo shared a little bit with me about that as we went along. But as I was leaving, some of the people that had been initially opposed to me coming because of their beliefs about women in pastoral ministry were so warm and supportive in the end. I remember one lady said that you can't judge a book by its cover. That's what she had learned through our time together. So that was Chula Vista. And then Yucaipa, having been in seminary, I felt I'm glad I had that early experience because it gave me some important questions to ask in seminary. It gave me a different perspective. And in Yucaipa.
So how long were
go
you
ahead.
how long were you at Chula Vista before you went to seminary?
About a year and a half.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. It was a good experience. I recommend it.
I do too. And of course, we can't always choose sometimes, as pastors say.
Right.
But I think we were talking before I pressed record about some of our journey and as well. And I pastored 4 years before I went to seminary full time. I was taking some classes because of the program I was in. But I agree with you 100%. The years that I pastored, and most of my pastoring was in small districts, so I didn't have any immediate mentor, or I wasn't blessed in that way as you were. But to your point, it was when I went to seminary, my mind, the way I thought, and the questions I had were a bit different, and I can tell at some level than those that hadn't pastored per se. Particularly, of course, the more practical classes, right? About leading and so on. So I can totally relate with that. So you were at Chula Vista for about a year and a half. You go to seminary, and now you come back to Yucaipa. That's where you left off.
Yucaipa.
And then what happened?
Well, again, I had a great mentor, Pastor Heinz Stratum, and it was incredible the connections that we had. So my maternal and paternal grandfathers had both been head elders at previous churches that he had pastored back in South Africa. So just crazy, strange family connections that now I'm pastoring under his supporting on his team. Who would have thought that God leads in such strange ways with the generations? So Yucaipa was a wonderful experience. I think the biggest thing that I learned there and that we learned in our time together is the importance of mentoring and empowering church members. When I first arrived, the people who were leading various ministries like BBS, they were so relieved that I was there. They were ready to give me their jobs. And I said, well, wait just a minute. So I said, okay, I'll take the lead. I'll take that. But we have to do this together as a team. And I'll take the burden. But let's do this. And so the only way that it was able to be successful with such different ministry groups is by investing in the church members that were already leading. And they wanted to hand me the baton and have me run with it. But we were able to find ways to distribute the work better, that we could really do it together. And when I left, some of them were saying, well, I didn't understand what you were doing at first. I thought you just wanted us to do your job. But now that you're leaving, I understand that you were helping prepare us and walk with us through that so that we could continue on once you left. Again, discipleship, mentoring, empowering others instead of trying to do everything myself. Because I think that's definitely a temptation for me. Because I often don't want to hand something over either because I want to be in control. Or because I care. I don't want to give them the burden, but sometimes you don't realize that it's actually a blessing for that person to serve, right? I don't assume it's going to be a burden for them. It could be a blessing. And then finally, it's complex to delegate. It's easier initially to just do it yourself. And there's a old saying that you can go fast alone, but you can go further together. And so, handing over, being a team and supporting others to do the work together.
I always love to hear, particularly from pastors. Now, you've been pastoring now for many years, and to expound and relive a little bit of those first couple of years, right? And it seems, as you said, you were blessed with some very good mentors, and that's always helpful. It also seems to me, and again, I'm going off a little bit of what I read in your book and what you're telling me now, and it's that you went in there, you had this mentorship, as we mentioned, but it also seemed that you did you have been doing, and you can speak into this before we get into your book here. Two of the things that sometimes we can say they're very basic, which they are, and they're very obvious, which they are as well. And it's this: to love God and to love the people, even those that perhaps don't love us at times when we first meet them, whether it's because you're coming in there as their first, female pastor and their views, or, me coming into a district and they have their own thoughts or they don't agree with me or whatever it is. And that's been a journey. I'll just speak for myself here. It's been a journey for me, right? To be able to do the essence of loving those. Even it's easy to love, as the Bible says, it's easy to love those that love us. It's when we have these strong disagreements and people are treating us unfairly in the way that we view it, right? So it seems to me like God really blessed you, right? And empowering you to, of course, put God first and then just love people in the midst of leading and journeying with them. Is that fair to say?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I think some of that, at least I learned from my grandfather. And I just saw how he treated people and how much he cared about people. I've always been fascinated by people and learning about people. And so I feel that every single person has strengths and weaknesses. Often the weaknesses are the flip side of those very strengths. And so when you can, if someone is doing something that's hurtful to you or to me, if I can try and understand that it's really not about me, it's about whatever they're dealing with, and that many times the behavior that to me is frustrating is actually a flip side of a strength that they have. And so how can I love them for who they are and appreciate them, and care for them without judgment. Assuming the best, assuming their best intentions. And I've been in plenty of conflicts where it's been very difficult to do that. I remember I went on sabbatical. When I came back from sabbatical, it was actually, the sabbatical was my first step in writing this book. And the church that I was at the time had never had a pastor go on sabbatical. And someone from the church, as I was coming back, I was going to come back in a couple of weeks, someone contacted me and said, there are conversations happening about perhaps that maybe some people are talking, some of the elders or various people, that maybe it's time for you to move on from this position. And so, that was very difficult for me, right? Because a sabbatical is 12 weeks. And I was looking forward to rejoining the church there and my leadership. And I'd been there for 5 years, at the church at the time. And so I didn't know what to make of this. I prayed about it. I even talked to my grandfather about it. And, I was impressed to, just have one-on-one conversations with the elders, connect with each one, and not really, bring these things up directly, but just ask, how did things go? I was gone, and how can we work together better moving forward, and just see what came up. And as I reconnected with people, it seemed like what I had heard was probably different from what was really happening, and that it was maybe there were some thoughts and feelings expressed, but I don't think there was a big meeting where people were trying to oust me, that kind of thing. It was overblown. But when I got to the person that I felt like was probably the source of the most feelings about it, we sat down and we ate a meal together, and we were able to really talk. And we did talk about this question. And we both ended up in tears. And there was a real reconnecting and support. And, it was a beautiful conversation and time together. And it became clear that this person's, their concerns were concerns for me based on their own experience that they had had.
Yeah.
And so it was what they were feeling and sensing in their life experience that led them to feel that way. And we were able to unearth that and reconcile with each other. And nothing came of those conversations in a negative sense.
Well, I think it's the power of, back to what the original part, right, about loving people, and just the fact that the Spirit led you to have conversations in love with people. And, nothing beats that, I think, in the sense of you can do a Zoom meeting or whatever software you want to use, FaceTime, all that. Praise God for all of that. I mean, right now you and I are video conferencing and we're recording here. But I mean, would I rather do this in person? Of course. Back to those conversations. Those are in-person conversations that are powerful, speaking on this topic that, hey, I've been hearing these things, or I got this email, and then specifically with the one that sent it to you, that it's beautiful of what happens when the Spirit leads, and that the foundation is love in Christ. We're all together in this, and let's talk about this. And sometimes we don't do that, I guess is what I'm getting at. And so praise God that you did do that. And granted, not always it ends up in that, wonderful kumbaya moment. But often more times than not, it does end up in a sense of, hey, at least I understand better where you're at, and vice versa. Or at least I think that's part of the ultimate plan, right? Is that fair?
Right. For sure. And pastoral ministry is, I've seen enough moments of people coming and going that when there is conflict, if you could stay a little longer and work through that and then leave, everyone's in a healthier space. Usually, sometimes you don't have that choice. And sometimes for the sake of your mental health, emotional health, maybe it's time to leave. But people are people, and most people, when it comes down to it, don't wish their pastors harm.
Right.
They don't. And they might be hurting. They might be frustrated. And so if we can work through those things together, it doesn't always resolve itself to be a reconciliation, but I think we're all healthier, for that. And, loving people, and they will, love you back in their own time, in their season. And sometimes it's after you leave, they'll love you back.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
Well, again, thank you for sharing. I mean, we can definitely talk about these different stories, right? Because as pastors, we're blessed to be able to interact. And part of love, I believe, is, and I think this is what you're saying as well, is to have these conversations that are tense at times, but it's for the ultimate essence of redemption in whatever form that is, redeeming a relationship, redeeming a situation, that needs to be talked about for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the movement and the mission of God. And with that, I want to continue our conversation. Speaking of moving the mission forward, I believe the topic in your book is so crucial. And so I want to begin to dig into that. And I mentioned to you a little bit how I came across your book, but here I'll just tell you that one of the things that caught my attention, aside from the picture of two people running, and anybody who's heard this podcast several times knows that I'm an avid runner, and so are you. We'll talk about that in a moment here. And so that the cover caught my attention. And then another part of that was the subtitle, right? So for those that may not know, her book is called In Grandpa's Shoes, and the subtitle is An Invitation to Intergenerational Connection. And so that subtitle said intergenerational connection. I mean, and that's so crucial in our church today, because we're living in many of our churches are so diverse, not only in ethnic background, but obviously in these different age groups that we're going to talk about or mention in just a moment. But let me back up and just ask you, why did you decide to write a book about intergenerational connections?
So I was so blessed and have been through my relationship with my grandfather. And he really inspired me both in terms of pastoral ministry and in terms of running. He started running long distance at age 60.
Wow.
So I got
Amazing.
to witness a lot of that. And he ran his last half marathons at age 90. So he was turning 90 in 2017. He was turning 90. And I realized I had the opportunity to take a sabbatical here in Southeastern. It's a beautiful gift that after 7 years, you can apply to take 12 weeks, do something refreshing, and renewing. And, so I realized I wanted to tell my grandfather's story because I felt like it's been such a blessing to me. But then I wanted to tell my own story as well. So I can't just tell his story without sharing the impact on me. And then I realized this is bigger than just him or just me. This is really about the connection between the two of us. And then I don't want to just highlight that. Like I had an amazing experience. I wanted to create a tool for other people to strengthen and deepen, those connections and intergenerational connections. Basically, I'm talking about authentic relationships between people of different generations.
Okay.
And so when I was picturing this book and visioning it and putting it together, I wanted it to be a tool that people could use. Either they read it by themselves and then use some of the questions with the relationship, or they invite someone else one-on-one to read it together and share the discussions, or do it in a small group. And I wanted people to have very practical ways to deepen those connections and find people to do that with.
Well, I love it. And I already want to encourage people. We'll have it in the show notes, ways that people can purchase the book. And we'll be giving some away as well. But it is filled with amazing stories of your grandfather. Now, I know his name because I obviously, again, read the book from cover to cover. But why don't you tell us your grandfather's name?
So his name is Eric Webster.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pastor Eric Webster, right? Because he pastored, he was a professor and did
Yes.
many, many things. And he's one of the main characters in the book, if I can say it that way. But the more I read about him, you did it very well. And I'm just giving you my 2 cents that I want to meet him. And on an even more personal way, I want to run with him.
Oh,
and so
that's beautiful.
I would have
Love
loved
that.
to have run with him in the Comrades as he did, or wherever. I think it would have been an amazing conversation for those times as well, because he clearly did some amazing things that impacted your life, and you were able to share that in the book, but also make it in a way where how does that apply to anybody who's, listening, both a challenge and for how we act and connect with one another from different generations, as you're talking about in the book. And so let me even ask a further question regarding that. So you and I were talking beforehand of how many generations are currently present alive right now, right? And so I think we ended on 7, and you helped me with that, right? Because I said 6, and you said, well, there's the 7th, there's the greatest generation, which my grandfather, and I said, well, yeah, absolutely, right? So we have that generation, the silent generation, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. Now, I'm no sociologist, but I think, and you can help me here, this must be one of the times in history where we have maybe some of the most different generations alive at one time. And I could be wrong.
Yes.
Okay.
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Longevity is increasing. Yeah.
Right. All right. With that said, and with that in mind, what are some of the challenges that you feel the church is facing in fostering intergenerational relationships, and how can we overcome them?
So we live in a very segregated time by age. And so if you just drive to church on a Sabbath morning and you pull up in the car, where everyone goes their different directions usually. And even our Sabbath schools that are for adults are often segregated by age. And I understand why that is. Different generations have different needs. Certainly from the little ones, we have one in tiny tots and a couple in the pre-K and kindergarten Sabbath schools. Their needs are different. They get bored if they're in the other or what have you. So there's a time and a place to be with people of your same generation. The challenge is when we're all together, it's a moment where we're all sitting, being quiet and listening to someone talk up front. So there's not really an opportunity to connect with people of different generations and talk and listen and hear. And so we have to take advantage of other times and other ways and chances to do that. I think probably one of the most common challenges is just recognizing the importance of it and the value of it from the beginning. Well, why is this valuable or important? And in the introduction to the book, I mentioned quite a few different studies that have been done that showed some studies that have been done that showed the incredible benefit of people under 30 and above 50 connecting for all sorts of, from physical benefits to mental benefits, emotional self-worth, all of these different ways. And I think sometimes as a church, we haven't recognized the incredible value of that. Certainly, I think that has changed in recent times with all the work that the Fuller Youth Institute have done. I've mentioned a few of their books in my book, but they found that one of the biggest indicators that a young person will stay committed to the church and connected with Jesus is that they have, in the earlier book, they mentioned five adults that know them and connect with them. And then in the book Growing Young, they talk about fostering intergenerational relationships is one factor of churches that are really thriving and growing. Right. And people are looking for these relationships and don't know where to find them. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for the church to provide something that people are struggling to find even in the larger culture and society. So perhaps some of the common challenges are just recognizing that this is very valuable and this is important. And then the practical issues of, well, how do I start? Where do I go? And our lives are so full and busy. How can I can't even add one more thing. What can I do? So, I've tried in the book to offer some suggestions, even small things that can be done, in addition to having a tool that you could really sit and invest with for 13 weeks. The book is 13 weeks intentionally, so that it can fit into a quarter. So if as a Sabbath school, if you wanted to start a new Sabbath school that said, okay, for this time, we would like to recruit some of our youth and some of our young adults and some of our from the different generations and do a new Sabbath school just for a quarter to do this together.
Right. And just to jump in here for a moment, at the end of every chapter, you have questions, really good questions that help foster the essence of talking about the chapter they read, but also then interacting one with the other, right? And see what the person of a different age group will say. And I like that many of them you start with, and maybe you can talk about this, and I'm using my own words. Maybe I should look at the book and use your words, but I'll let you do that. The essence of being a place where the person of any generation that's, perhaps in this Sabbath school, this small group, that they feel safe speaking up, even if I guess the other person obviously is not going to agree with their response of the theme, the topic that chapter is covering through the different stories. Because that's what you do. You have these different topics that you cover through some of the stories of your family, which I found that really nicely done and that thread throughout the book. So yeah, tell us about that and maybe some of the responses that you've had, because you have done this with different groups. So maybe speak a little bit of that towards that as well.
Yeah. So I really benefited from Pastor Tara Vincross's book that she wrote, Deep Calling on Being and Growing Disciples.
Yeah, she's been on the podcast. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. So I have to give her credit. We did Deep Calling at Lost Area University Church, and I really loved the process that she took people through, for in the beginning, having a covenant, and then agreeing on group rules, and what talking together with what makes this a safe space. We're going to show up or let each other know if we're not coming. So we're just not, MIA. We're going to, not give advice unless asked for, or we ask it ahead of time. We're going to not have any judgment, and we're going to show up too by sharing what's on our heart. And so, having the group together help create these rules and agree to the rules from the beginning, I think is so important, and it really sets up a safe space for this whole duration of the group. The other thing that she does beautifully in Deep Calling is have groups of 2. So I've called them conversation partners, and she called them spiritual companions. But you have one other person that's your partner.
Okay.
And then groups of 4. And so you have 2 partners together, and then you have the larger group. So the flow is able to, so the beginning, there's questions with the larger group in mind, getting the juices flowing and the conversation going. And then there's some questions that are meant for the group of 4, and some questions are meant for just the 2. And so I tried to create it in such a way that some of the more personal, deeper questions that need more time to unpack, there's just 2 people to do that together, and then the 4, and then going from there. And she recommends, with deep calling, having people, share, if you're doing it in person, you could just have people walk towards each other, that they're going to be partners, and they're of different generations in this case. Or I did this on Zoom. I had people, message me, a few people that they feel drawn towards. And then I had the joy of a huge puzzle piece of, okay, these 2 are going to be together, and this group of 4 is going to be together. And it was so beautiful to see the group of 2 and the group of 4. And many times we had 4 different generations in that group of 4. And it was so beautiful to, create a safe space, and set it up. And then, within the group having people have those relationships. And, so the original groups that I did were back in the spring of 2001. And the youngest at the time, was an 8th grader, 13-year-old, and the oldest was 96.
Okay. And you said 2001, but I'm assuming is, you said 2001.
I'm sorry.
2021. I figured just for those listening, just Thank to make sure they're like, did she just say 2001?
No.
2021. Sure. Okay.
2021. And at that time, we were still being somewhat cautious and doing a lot on Zoom. And I had such a beautiful experience with deep calling on Zoom. And I found that when you set up these parameters, Zoom can be incredibly close, sometimes even closer than in person, because people are in their natural. I know that's a surprise to say, if it's set up well. So people, we agree to have our cameras on, we agree to show up, because the downfall is, people can tune out on Zoom more than in person. Sure. But if everybody's committed, there's something about being in your own home space. And then being able to switch people quickly from partners to groups, and then having the chat so people can share at any time. If they might not feel comfortable to share in the larger group, but they can share that way. It can be incredibly bonding. So, in July, the woman that was 96, she's turning 100. I'm so grateful that we still have her with us. I did a podcast to go with the book. My first time any experience podcasting, but I wanted to do an episode for each chapter of the book.
Okay.
And so I had many of the people that have been in this small group be part of the podcast and interview them on their experience with the chapter and the questions.
Make sure you give me that link, and I'll share it in the show notes.
I will. It's probably the most secret podcast that's out there. I will share it with you. So it's been beautiful to see over time the relationships. One of the young lady that was part of that is graduating this year, and she and the women that were partners, she's the older woman is a boomer, and they stayed connected this whole time. They even did a small group together in the fall. This last fall, they led a small group together. And that relationship would never have happened if it wasn't for them taking the time to be part of something like this.
So that's beautiful. I think this is, as you mentioned earlier, something that we as a community of faith, we do value. And you also mentioned that we are overall living longer. Particularly Adventists are known for that. And so we have all these generations. And before we went into the aspect of that safe space and making people sure are committed with the essence of the small group, you were going to tell us some of the ways that we could overcome the challenges, right, to coming together, which you were already talking about. And absolutely, we live, quote, it's a famous word, I've used it, we've all used it, busy lives. And so, but within those busy lives, I also think, and I'm just speaking here for myself, that we always make time for what we really value in our lives, if we're honest with ourselves. And there are several ways that I could have done better in my life to have intergenerational relationships, right? So with that said, and with just being transparent with that, how can we do better as a church community, but just as individuals living our lives in the, quote, busyness of our activities of daily living?
Right. Well, they say that one of the best ways to make a new habit is to attach it to something you're doing already. And so I would say for anybody that's listening right now and they want to develop more intergenerational connections, think first of what you do every day anyway. And think about the people that you're connecting with anyway to start with. And when it comes to church, without changing anything in terms of programming or anything, I think the easiest place to start is to try to find a few people of different generations that you learn their name and you make it a point to greet them and try to build that conversation. So many churches have the greeting time and we all go around and say high five and happy Sabbath and all of that. But perhaps in that moment, try to, if it's a young person, a teenager or someone of the older generations, find out their name and make a point to greet them and ask them something about their week. And that's a small thing that you can do to make that time at church, if you have that time, a little bit more meaningful. You might get to fewer people, but you might be able to have a more meaningful connection. Look right around at the people that are sitting next to you already. And again, it's a small thing. Learn someone's name. And then think of a question to ask them about their week or anything they're looking forward to in the next week.
I want to ask this question before we jump into maybe you telling us a few stories in your book. But before we get there, how have you been able to do this now at La Sierra, right? With a big church like La Sierra, I would assume multi-generational church, as we talked about. So how have you guys been able to implement some of this in the local church where that is taking, place? A lot of people that listen to this podcast are pastors, lay leaders, church members, of course. And so they're going to be asking, okay, how can I really do this? One way, as you just mentioned, is to ask and to maybe say hi to less people, but ask better questions to one or two of a different generation. So here's the word, be intentional to who we're going to say hi to, not just say hello to those that we normally would say hello to and we already connect with. I think that's the unsaid but kind of said aspect.
Right.
But along with that, right, how would somebody start, like just saying, let me use this book and just jump in? Maybe it's just one way, but any other way that maybe La Sierra is doing it, or any other church that you're aware of that those listening can maybe be inspired from?
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress.
Sure.
One of the best ways that we found to build connections is through service. And so actually serving together, it's been a beautiful thing. The Sabbath school has taken one Sabbath of every month to serve in our food pantry plus packing. And so it's a great opportunity for them to serve. There's also adults there that are leading and directing and that they're getting connected to. And that's been a beautiful thing so we have a whole campus of college students, that are connected in with us, and we would like to be more connected in with us, not always as much as we would like. Service learning has been a way that we've been able to see that serving together. So one example is right now our social work students, as part of their service learning, are visiting some of our homebound members 7 times once a week for an hour as part of their assignment, and just getting to know each other and doing that. Almost every church will have a list of people that are homebound. And one way to do that is communion. So we have elders take communion, and we had a couple of our college students who were wanting to learn about, one was studying about loneliness on the senior population. And so she went along and did communion with elders. I think that could be a beautiful opportunity to do more. I'd like to see more of those connections happening with our seniors. And one way, again, if there's something that's already happening that we can then make intergenerational, instead of adding a new program, that can be less work for everyone or less stress, and just say, okay, so if I'm an elder and I'm going to go give someone communion, who can I take with me? What young person might be open to that? Who do I see that has that spiritual interest? And what a beautiful experience for them to get to do communion with someone in their home. So one big change we just made it last year recently to our youth and our children's pastor, did an incredible, beautiful thing of, we were struggling basically with our 7th and 8th grade ministry. Our 5th and 6th graders were having a hard time with volunteers and everything. And so, they created a new ministry called The Well for 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, modeled after high school ministry. With the idea that the 8th graders, the 7th and 8th graders were going to really be group leaders for the 5th and 6th graders. And all of the students would get the chance with a bigger group. They could all practice doing church together in a different way. And so instead of, twisting arms with adults to come and, teach these 5th and 6th graders, and they're sitting there bored, or waiting for the next illustration, or the 7th and 8th graders, instead, they're really serving one another, 5th through 8th, and modeling it after how we've been doing high school ministry, and they have something to look forward to. And recently, the praise band from The Well, led praise and worship for the big church for our main service. And it was just so beautiful to have 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, leading worship, for the whole church.
No, I love that. I appreciate that. I think those are some very practical aspects. So just going off from what you just mentioned there, the essence of serving, and then having the older, and in this case, the older was 7th, 8th graders, right? Serving the 5th, 6th graders, and the high schoolers serving the 7th and 8th graders in some way as well, which carries on to service, as you were mentioning before, serving actually in the community, with different ages and inviting one another. Those are all amazing practical ways. And then, as you mentioned, the essence of just having a conversation on Sabbath morning intentionally with somebody of a different generation, or I think the same way, and you mentioned more of this in the book, also just inviting somebody out to have a conversation with and I'm the one saying this, at a coffee shop or whatever it may be, just for lunch. For the purpose, and this is now where I'm going out with my next question. It's all of that for, in part, the purpose, and correct me if I'm wrong here, to learn from one another and learn of one another in our journeys of life, right? So you learned from your grandfather, but I would have to say your grandfather learned from you as well, because he was raised in a different generation, which your book points out, right? So with that said, tell us a few stories. Of course, you can read it in the book, but maybe I'm interested, the ones that maybe stood or stand out to you the most, or maybe a few that didn't make the book. I don't know. Here, first time said on a podcast that's not in your book, whatever you feel comfortable with. But yeah, if you can highlight a few lessons that stand out to you regarding connecting to a different generation in your family, you're with your grandfather or anybody else, and why does that particular one stand out?
Yeah, it's hard to, there are so many stories, but just to pick a few of the chapters. One chapter that was meaningful for me to write, but also very difficult, was the one, chapter 8 on racial injustice. And the experience of my grandfather growing up in apartheid South Africa, and his journey when it came to race, and trying to figure out what to say about that as a white woman, and going through. I was writing this chapter during the protests after the death of George Floyd, and just what can we say? And, I'm not, what can I say that's true and honest? And one of the stories that came from that book, is that my grandfather told about how, when he was teaching at Heidelberg College, the cafeteria, the students that were people of color that were allowed into the school were not allowed, to eat in the cafeteria at the time. And my grandfather, this was actually pointed out to him, by, another professor that was visiting, from, I think, the US, that was really appalled by the situation and basically said, well, why don't you do something about it? And my grandfather, in reflecting back on that experience, really regretted that he didn't do anything about that he really, let the status quo be the status quo. And I think, sharing, with other generations what we're proud of, and also the moments that we feel like we failed in that moment, to do what we believe would be the right thing to do. And we just, accepted what it was. And so, the incredible thing is that, when I was looking for readers for this book, to give me feedback, I wanted to have a diverse group of readers. And I thought about a fellow pastor that I knew that was a person of color, and a pastor from South Africa. And his name is Dr. Ron Dupree. And, I asked him if he would read the book and give me feedback. He gave wonderful, wonderful comments. He's actually still giving me feedback of, typos or various edits for the next edition. He's fantastic, a great writer, and, brilliant. So when he was reading this chapter, he said he was one of those 3 students that wasn't allowed to eat in the cafeteria.
Wow. So
we had a moment together for me to say, wow, tell me more about that. What was that like for you? And, so he gave me a little bit more information that I was able to put in the book about what those, sons did after that. And he told me the story of how his father had also taken theology, a generation before at Heidelberg College, but he hadn't been allowed to graduate as a person of color. And years later, in recent times, he was honored, Dr. Dupree's father, to come back to Heidelberg and be able to graduate with the class that was graduating, and as a special guest of honor. And so that story illustrates to me that, we don't always get it right. And we shouldn't be just sharing with the next generations what we're proud of and what we wish they would do. It's important for us to be vulnerable and share where we haven't lived up to what we know now or what we wish we had done at the time. Those stories are important to tell too.
I think that's very powerful. So what I hear you saying, just as you just mentioned there, to share in transparency, not only in areas that we have succeeded or telling the younger generation what they should and shouldn't do, but actually also being honest in ways in which, whether it's Gen X, I'm a Gen Xer, or any other generation, as we're mentoring those that come after us, where we have not succeeded, where we have failed, where we have done wrong and learned, so that they don't make the same mistakes, right? Which is normally what we do. Parents normally do that, right? We say, hey, I didn't do this right. I'm letting you know this, and you're a parent. You have 3 incredible kids, and so you're aware of that aspect of where you don't want them to make the same mistakes that you have made, that we have made overall.
Right.
And so I love that, but that extends, is what I'm hearing you say, right, to just how we can help each other and the importance of intergenerational relationships and connections in the church. Where if I'm sitting down with your grandfather, here we go again, right? Or we're running and he's telling me this same story, but now he's telling me That's powerful, because this is firsthand experience of him and how he lived his life and how he corrected that and how he did amazing things, because he did some amazing things that you read in the book that really brought him in a long way because of the way and where he was raised, as you mentioned. Is that fair to say?
Right. Yes, very much so. And when we are vulnerable, and we share when we disappointed ourselves, or looking back, we feel disappointed about a choice that we made or a mistake. It allows other generations to be more open and honest with us. Because then we're a safe space for them to share their disappointments and failures, and the importance of getting back up and going on. So another story. So in chapter 7, I talk about the signs and stepping out in faith. So my grandparents, after retirement, took on as an independent ministry the Signs of the Times magazine in South Africa, because they believed in it, that it was important, and they mortgaged their house.
That's
in
incredible
retirement.
story. Incredible story, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. And God was blessed them so much through that. And the reason I bring up that story, and it's a shocking story, really, so many times where they didn't have the money to send out the magazine, and then someone just turns out had left money in their will, and it was just the right amount, that they needed. And things don't always happen that way, but I think God sometimes answers our prayers in those kind of dramatic ways to encourage us, and strengthen our faith and our trust. And I bring out that story because the moments in our lives where we really felt that we saw God move in surprising ways, meaningful ways, it's important to share those. It's a testimony to what God has done in our lives, and it encourages faith and trust and hope in others. And so, sharing the stories of the moments that we've seen, miracles, as it were. And the way I would define a miracle is something that is incredibly good that happened and was not expected to happen, was completely not supposed to happen that way, as it were. Unexpected and good things that happen that we can thank God and praise God for. So also in that chapter, though, to remember that things don't always work out the way we would hope. At the end of that chapter, I share that my grandfather worked really hard to try and pass along the Signs of the Times that he wanted it to continue. The union took it on. He had someone that he mentored, and they were excited about it, and they were doing it for a while, but again, the times change, and priorities and budgets all influence, and without someone pushing for it or advocating for doing it as an independent ministry, eventually the Signs of the Times is no longer happening in South Africa in that form, in that way. And it's important too to recognize that God leads us to start things, but just because they die, as it were, it doesn't mean that God wasn't in them, and the time that God used them wasn't very, very meaningful. Something doesn't have to be permanent in order to be a work of God and meaningful. And so recognizing that we're given this moment to run our race, as it were, and just because the particular program or avenue that God called us to do is not continuing doesn't mean that it wasn't a gift from God and important to do our part in that season.
Absolutely. It's clear that the Lord used your grandfather, obviously, in many different ways. And as you were just alluding to and mentioned, that sometimes things are for a season. And during that season, God blesses and touches, and the mission of God moves forward. And then seasons change, technologies change, and things begin to evolve in ways in which like you said, what was working worked and the Lord blessed, but now it's time to do it in a different way, because at the end of the day, and I think we can all agree with this, meaning I firmly, I don't know him, but I think he would agree because of this. This is, and then you can speak into it. Because at the end, as I mentioned earlier, to me, it's always been about, as a follower of Jesus, to become more like Jesus and therefore move the mission of God forward, because that's what Jesus would want us to do. And that's what I see in your grandfather. He was relentless, not only in his ability to start running at 60 and continue on into his 90s, but that same impetus he had, it seemed, throughout most of his life, and well into his retirement years as well, which is amazing. It was an inspiration to me. So I want to thank you for putting it into print and letting us know, and I'm assuming maybe podcast as well, that you're going to share with us, and seeing how God has blessed him and blessed how he stepped out in faith, which that's one of my, I'm going to say it here, that's one of my favorite chapters, and perseverance at the end. I just appreciated the whole book, but those particular chapters I really liked. They were speaking to me, so thank you for that. Raewyn, before I let you go, any last thoughts in regards to this or anything else?
Thank you so much for, again, the opportunity to be with you. I think as we follow Jesus, God puts people in our path, and we don't necessarily have to go far to find them. Using a running illustration, we can run and look at who's close to us, who's running next to us, and be more intentional about getting to know who they are, listening to them, finding ways in our life season, in our moment, with what we feel called to do, with what gives us joy, to care for people. And my grandfather, in his senior years here, he's 96 now, he moved to Berrien Springs, Michigan to live with my mom and my stepdad there. And he started caring for chickens and and the eggs. And so for him, he always loved chickens, and it was something he could enjoy. But then he takes those eggs and he's built relationships with the neighbors along the street. Some of the neighbors he gives the eggs to, some have started paying him for eggs, and then he gives regularly and does that with the neighbors. But he has built friendships and relationships and connections with neighbors, being asked to participate in one of the neighbors' funerals, building authentic relationships where he is with what he enjoys, raising chickens and having eggs to share with neighbors. And so wherever you are, whatever season, wherever you're running your race, look around you with who already is in your path and find ways to strengthen those relationships. And if it's maybe it's during the Sabbath school time, and you feel like, oh, this is something your Sabbath school could do together, and you could invite a few people that aren't currently attending. There's always youth as well that are not connected in with their Sabbath school. Maybe ask your youth pastor who just has not fit in, and could we do this book together with them, with our adult Sabbath school? And again, using the programs and the avenues that are already in place. Doesn't have to be a huge extra work or effort, but being more intentional with strengthening the connections with the people that God has already placed in your path.
Powerful. I want to thank you, Raewyn, for writing this book. Again, the book is called In Grandpa's Shoes, An Invitation to Intergenerational Connection. It has some amazing stories and just really a great book to be intentional to create these intergenerational connections. So thank you for allowing God to lead you in writing this book. Thank you for sharing these stories that some are personal, but you put them here very eloquently in the book. It's it's a fun book to read. It just flows because of the many stories.
Thank you.
But it also is within the essence of being fun with the stories because everybody loves good stories, right? It also brings challenges for us to consider as well. So I want to thank you for drawing that tension there within the story of the book overall. And so please, also on behalf of us here at the Restore Podcast and the Florida Conference, just say thank you to Pastor Eric Webster for being faithful to God, faithful to his ministry, and being faithful to not only teaching you, but your sister and just your entire family and being an example. And now you are an example of following and being faithful to Jesus. So thank you, Raewyn. May God continue to bless you, your family, and your ministry.
Thank you so much. God bless.
Once again, thank you, Pastor Raewyn, for your time and sharing your heart with us. And of course, for writing the book. Continued blessings to you, your family, and ministry. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm giving away 5 of her books thanks to the partnership with Advent Source. If you are one of the first 5 to text me or email me, I will send you a copy of her book. You can text me by clicking on the link on the show notes that says that you can text us, or you can email me at Javier, JAVIER.Diaz, DIAZ, at floridaconference.com. And if you are one of the first 5 to do so, I will send you her book for free. Don't forget to check out the show notes that also has a link where you can purchase the book via Advent Source, and you can also check out the podcast that goes along with the book. We have some great episodes coming up, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, and I'd love for you to rate and review the podcast, and lastly, of course, share it with someone the Lord may be leading you to. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, God bless.
Thank you for listening to this Restore podcast. We hope you've been blessed. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our inspiring episodes.